also from Emerge. And we have a very special guest that I'm going to introduce to you in a few moments. And welcome to Why Did GHG Emissions Go Up in 2018? But before we begin our program, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. Of course, this is specific to Guelph, but we also recognize that our main speaker this evening is joining us from Toronto. As we gather, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a community, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. Today, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples and whose traditional territory we are leaving. And from a housekeeping perspective, we are asking 3 poll questions altogether when you join the meeting, and we'll have 2 other poll questions during the event. And I also want to point out that we also have the opportunity for you to take questions later. We ask that you use the chat button in the bottom that should be visible at the bottom of your screens. We want this to be informal and fun. Please get comfortable in your chair, and well, let's proceed. I'm going to switch on to some slides here. If ask to take control of the share my screen here for a second. There we go. Very quickly, Emerge fights climate change. And our goal is for the community of Guelph as a whole to reach 100% renewable energy. Currently, the city has 2 specific targets. One is 100% renewable energy for the corporation of the city of Guelph. And we're very proud to have had a pivotal role in making that happen. And citywide, the city has a goal of hitting net zero carbon by 2050. And frankly, we don't think that's quick enough. And that net zero carbon aspect, we don't think it's good enough either. We honestly believe that the community as a whole needs to be much more aggressive and strive towards that 100% renewable, and we need to find a target that's much sooner than that. So why are we doing this evening, tonight? This looking back in the rearview mirror, so to speak, at what happened in 2018. Why are we, from an Emerge perspective, doing it is that it's part of a larger strategy that we're working on related to greenhouse gases and EVs. But when I say EVs, acronyms, GHGs being greenhouse gases and EVs being electric vehicles. And tonight, rather, we're looking in the rearview mirror. That we're looking at why on earth did emissions go up in 2018? Not something that we were expecting, considering that for quite a number of years they were going down. So this is the first piece of that of a series of events that we're working on these issues related to greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to point you to next Wednesday, which is Clean Air Day, June 3rd, when our guest, Sarah Buchanan, will be instrumental in the release of a comprehensive report that will be released then. And it's quite exciting. We at Emerge were honored to be asked to be on the review committee. And the report looks at the health impacts of ICE vehicles. There's another acronym for you, but ICE is an internal combustion engine. It's a quick way, instead of saying gas and diesel vehicles, we refer to them as ICE vehicles in Southern Ontario, so internal combustion engines. What's quite exciting about this report is the depth to which it goes. And I think as environmental early adopters, all of you that are on this Zoom call today, I think what you're going to find is you're going to feel like a kid in a candy store when you see the results of this report. If I could possibly tease out one little thing, and hopefully Sarah doesn't get too upset with me on this one, but one of the pieces that I took out of, there's a ton of data, remarkable data, but the piece that stuck home with me is that those that suffer the most from vehicle-related air pollution in Southern Ontario will benefit the most from shifting to 100% EVs. Here's the clicker, specifically in lower income and in high density areas. And I find this one really quite interesting because, I think one of the criticisms of EVs is that it's very elitist. The only people that benefit are those that can afford it, when in fact, from an air pollution, more importantly, from a health perspective, it's actually those that can least afford a vehicle, let alone an EV. So next week, keep an eye out for it, Clean Air Day, June 3rd, that the comprehensive report will be released. And of course, depending on what kind of a news day it is, that will determine how much attention that's going to actually get. The next thing is something a little sillier, and I think that most of you, if not all of you, are on our newsletter list. And that's where we're trying to think way outside the box on how we program things related to climate change. And we realized that within the environmental movement, quite often we've got caught up in the argument of whatever it is, whether indeed greenhouse gas emissions are as bad as they are, or whether people should get EVs or not. We want to change the narrative on it. So we enlisted 4 of our local politicians, namely Mike Schreiner, our MPP, Phil Alt, councillor for Ward 3, James Gordon, councillor for Ward 2, and Leanne Piper, councillor for Ward 5, all of whom have EVs, and their task next week is going to be to have a street fight where they trash talk each other to try to convince all of you, because all of you will be actually voting on whose EVs is the best. It's meant to be fun, and we're also honored to have retired Superior Court Justice Cass Harold as our MC for the night. So remember, June 23rd is the Guelph release of that report, and we're getting pretty excited about seeing that. And on that note, I want to hand the screen over to Sarah Buchanan so that I could just look at my notes for a second and introduce her. Sarah, do you want to take the screen now?
Absolutely, Evan. I will attempt to press this big green button here and share my screen. There we go. Can you see that?
And so if you just bear with me for another second.
I'm excited for this street fight next week.
Yes, it should be fun. So we're very happy to have Sarah Buchanan with us today. She's a program manager of Clean Economy at Environmental Defence Canada. And Sarah Buchanan, like probably many of you who are environmental activism at a very early age, in her case it was 6. And she was a bit of a fashionista because she proudly began by wearing a t-shirt with the word recycle spelled out in silver sequins on her t-shirt. She's worked for the last 15 years in advocacy, media and politics in both Ontario and British Columbia. And she was inspired to join Environmental Defence's team through a desire to drive a swift action on climate change, and now works with people, businesses, and governments to advocate for climate solutions in Ontario. We're honored to have her with us this evening. Sarah, I turn things over to you.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks so much for that introduction. I really wish, every time I hear that intro, I wish I still had the t-shirt with recycling on it, and I do not have it anymore. So that is very sad for me and for everyone watching that I can't be wearing that right now. I just want to take a brief moment because I am in Toronto, so I want to just begin that I'm acknowledging that I'm here in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory and is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, as is Guelph as well. So as Evan mentioned, I work on our climate change team at Environmental Defence. And I focus mostly on Ontario. So I'm here to talk a little bit about Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions, what direction they're going in, and how Ontario is adding to the impacts of climate change, and also a little bit about what we can do about it so that it's not all doom and gloom. Okay. Let's be able to, there's a poll. Okay. So I'll let you all take a second to do a poll here, and then I will try to go to my next slide. There we go, slide 2. Okay. So Ontario's emissions went up in 2018, And I think that if you saw the intro for this webinar, that you probably know that that is the case, and that maybe you want to find a little bit more about why. And I made this very fancy graph that has a line on it that shows that emissions were going down in Ontario for many years, and then they suddenly spiked in 2018. So I'm here to talk a little bit about why that might be. I will also read out the results of the poll here, which is very interesting. The question asked is, do you think that taking stronger environmental action in Ontario will help with economic recovery from COVID-19? And it looks like mostly, oh, you know what? I'm not going to read out the results because people are still taking it. So I'm just going to shift this over so that it's not in my way and let everyone else worry about the poll. So in 2018, Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions spiked, as I mentioned, and that was after a decline of a few years. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why 2018? And so why, after many years, would that go up? What was special about 2018 that meant that emissions might have gone up? So you might all remember 2018 when there was a provincial election. So you can't help but tie it in a little bit with some of the policy decisions that were made on climate change in 2018. But even I was surprised by how much emissions went up in 2018. And, you know, Ford's destructive actions couldn't possibly work that quickly to have them go up within 1 year. And I will pause for a moment and just let you know that the reason we're not talking about 2019 or 2020 is because we just don't have data that's that recent. The federal government releases their greenhouse gas emissions data about 2 years behind. So we don't actually know right now what our greenhouse gas emissions levels are for 2020 or for 2019. The most recent data we have is from 2018. So every spring when they release, Environment Canada releases new greenhouse gas emissions data from 2 years ago, a bunch of nerds like me descend upon it and look at it and tear it apart and see where greenhouse gas emissions increased, where they decreased, and what the trends and the patterns are. But needless to say, the fact that greenhouse gas emissions went up in 2018 may not have been a coincidence that it was the same year that there were massive cuts to things like cap and trade and all the climate change programs that came with it. And I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into that. But first, I just want to set the stage here and ask, you know, why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this weird thing called greenhouse gas emissions? And just zoom out a little bit and talk about how, you know, what we're fighting for. So Canada, as many of you know, is warming at twice the global average, and then we're already seeing impacts in Ontario. So I'm sure a lot of you, you know, might actually be sweating in your homes right now, and maybe, you know, had a tough sleep last night because it was so hot. And it's May. That's pretty strong evidence that that it's getting hotter, and that we're seeing impacts like heat waves happening more often and earlier in the year in Ontario. And so floods, fires, things like that. The evidence is all around us. And also that Ontario has a big, big role in whether or not Canada can meet our greenhouse gas emissions targets. There's so many of us in Ontario, and we pollute a lot. So we're a make or break province, mostly just due to our sheer size. So what we do in Ontario has a really big impact. Okay, and the next slide here. So before I talk about 2018 specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened first. So this part of our graph, what happened so that there was such a steady decline in greenhouse gas emissions, while, you know, many other provinces were actually seeing emissions go up ever so slightly, some less slightly than others. Because usually when you have an economy that's doing well, when you have a population that's growing, that tends to correlate with greenhouse gas emissions going up. But in Ontario, they were going down. And so some of the reasons for that were some of the big actions Ontario was taking to be a climate leader. The biggest action by far was the coal ban. So I'm sure many of you have probably heard about that. Ontario in the early 2000s actually banned using coal for electricity, burning coal for electricity. And coal was the source of a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and also a source of a lot of other nasty air pollution in Ontario. So it also made our air a lot cleaner. It reduced the number of smog days in Ontario. If you look here on the left at all these fancy colored lines, it shows you not only the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but also the reductions in a whole bunch of other nasty pollutants that do very bad things to our lungs when they get in there. And it actually saved us billions of dollars in healthcare costs on top of being the biggest greenhouse gas reduction action in North America. So we've been coasting on that for quite a long time, to be honest. And one of the big reasons that our greenhouse gas emissions have been steadily declining is that big step. But there were other steps that made a difference and have set us up for the success that we've had. So adding renewables like solar and wind power to our grid when they took away coal was a big step. And then planning to add more as well was another big step. Carbon pricing, so putting in a cap and trade system, which is a form of carbon pricing, that came in I think it was 2017, and was taken away in 2018. But having a price on pollution helped make industry, business, people think a little bit more about how much polluting they were going to do. When you add a price incentive, it tends to make people think twice about wasting things like fuel. And then the Climate Change Action Plan in Ontario is a big comprehensive plan that was funded by the money that came from cap and trade. So you had those big industrial polluters buying permits in order to pollute not above a certain limit and trading them around. That money that they had to pay, that went into a big fund, and that funded things like incentives for people to switch to more energy efficient furnaces. It paid for things like schools, getting energy retrofits and repairs. So it paid for a lot of good stuff that was helping to further reduce emissions. And it also paid for public housing getting retrofits as well to be more energy efficient. And it was working. So the first year of cap and trade, we actually did a deep dive on some of that.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Sarah, sorry, can you just go back for a second? I'm just wondering if you could just elaborate on why the fine particulate matter went up so significantly in 2010.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that because I actually don't have the answer to that question.
Okay, I didn't ask.
But I know PM 2.5 comes from a lot of different sources, and including some from transportation. It can come from a lot of different industrial sources. It can come from dust. So there could have been some other, forest fires are actually a big source of PM 2.5. So sometimes there are external factors that add to it, but I've literally never gotten that question in all the times I've shown this graph. So Evan, you win a prize, which is that I am going to find out the answer to your question at a later date. Okay. So the impacts here, we saw in the first year of cap and trade, when we dove in and looked at some of the data, there was actually a 15% decline in natural gas use, industrial natural gas use, not the natural gas use for heating. And when you have a price on carbon for big industrial users, that seemed to have an impact to be making them think about how much natural gas they were using. And then we also saw a huge increase in electric vehicle sales. So if you're familiar with Emerge Guelph, then you probably know a little bit about the incentives that were in place to help people be able to afford electric vehicles, very generous incentives as part of the Climate Change Action Plan. And they worked, not surprisingly. More people bought electric vehicles. Okay. And then, so now I'll talk a little bit about what happened after that. Obviously, I've talked about how the Ford government came in and there were some changes. Cap and trade was canceled, a lot of the programs along with it. And I want to talk a little bit about that and a lot of the other factors that happened. So first of all, how big was this spike? It was 10 megatons. That number is kind of meaningless to most people. But to put it in perspective, Canada-wide, there was an increase in 2018 in emissions of 15 megatons. So we went up from, 715-ish to 730-ish megatons that year. So over all of Canada, an increase of 15 megatons. 10 of that 15 megatons, 2/3 of it, just came from Ontario. And that's a little bit embarrassing because Ontario is only 40% of the Canadian population. So we really did more than our share of polluting in 2018. And it's also surprising because usually you see that kind of disproportionate emissions from provinces that are big oil and gas producers. Ontario is not. So Alberta, sometimes you do see outsized emissions from Alberta, but in Ontario, it's a little bit of a different story. And I should also say that emissions did go up in many other provinces in 2018, partly because it was a very cold year. There were some other factors in play. So it was a year where emissions did go up overall. But the trend for the last however number of years had been for Ontario to be bucking that trend. And while other provinces were going up, Ontario was going down. So it's not really an excuse to say those other provinces continued to ever so slightly go up. And Canada-wide, the trends were somewhat similar to in Ontario, where one of the big areas where greenhouse gas emissions went up was actually in transportation. And within that transportation, one of the main reasons greenhouse gas emissions went up is because people are buying bigger vehicles. They're buying SUVs, they're buying light trucks, they're buying Ford F-150s, and we're seeing across Canada an increase in emissions specifically from those kinds of vehicles. Okay, and the oil and gas sector also raised. So yeah, what happened in Ontario? So the big sort of in a nutshell description here is just that weather was a big factor. So I'm not going to say that it was all because of policy. This was a year where, even if all the policies had been in place, I suspect there would have been either like a flattening or maybe a very, very slight rise in greenhouse gas emissions, because it was a cold winter where people were using more natural gas to heat their homes. And then it was a hot summer on the other end. And in a hot summer, what happens is right at peak time when everyone's using electricity to be working on their laptops or whatever, it gets really hot. People turn on their air conditioners. It draws on the electricity grid. And when you hit those peak times where everybody is demanding a lot of energy, they have to fire up more natural gas plants in Ontario to help meet that demand. So all that pressure on the grid means more natural gas is burned. And we actually tend to use very little natural gas. It's the only fossil fuel in Ontario's grid. But when we do use it, it pollutes and it causes greenhouse gas emissions. So in a hot summer, it tends to cause more greenhouse gas emissions. Another factor, as I mentioned, is consumer preference. Consumers were buying bigger vehicles. So they're buying SUVs, they're buying light trucks. When I dug down into Ontario's data, that was very, very true. And greenhouse gas emissions grew just about as much from those vehicles as it did from trucks, from big freight trucks. And so it increased also from goods movement and trucking activity. That we tend to see when there's economic growth. And that's one of the things that correlates really strongly with economic growth, because when you get more people buying more things, those things have to be trucked around, they have to be delivered, more goods movement happens, and then you see more greenhouse gas emissions from trucking. And 2018 was a year when there was economic growth, but again, it was a year when there was, about the same, if not slightly less economic growth, GDP growth, than the year before, when there had been a decline in emissions. So it's still a bit worrying. And of course, another factor here was the government's cancellation of greenhouse gas reduction programs, as I mentioned, things like cap and trade and all of the programs that it funded. Okay, so I'll dive into a little bit the sectors where it increased. I've talked about this a little bit already. So we see the biggest jump. This graph, actually, thank you, Duncan Noble, if you are on this webinar, who provided this graph on Twitter. I really appreciated it and used it with his permission. So The biggest increase here, the biggest chunk was in buildings. And that's mostly from heating our buildings with natural gas. And that was by far the biggest rise in Ontario because of the amount of extremely cold days we had. Again, though, in 2014, we had the same number of extremely cold days. Our emissions went down that year. So it's not really an excuse. We also saw, as I mentioned, more SUVs and trucks and more freight. So there was an increase. Part of that increase was from transportation. And then we've got this little process and product use category here. That tends to be industry, and industrial emissions would have gone up with cap and trade lifted. So cap and trade was the carbon pricing system, and it applied to a lot of big polluters. And so suddenly with that program being yanked away and there's no price on carbon pollution for these big polluters for 6 months of the year, I have no doubt that that would have caused a slight increase in pollution from those industrial emitters who no longer had to buy permits to pollute. And then electricity. There was also an increase in electricity emissions, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. So I will just overall say that these all have, some explanations to them, but also that many other years had just as many things happen. They had cold snaps, they had heat waves, they had people buying bigger cars, they had freight increases, and Ontario still managed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'll talk a little bit about the climate programs that were in place, because those climate programs would have helped take the edge off. What would have happened is, it's not like our emissions would have gone down by, 20 megatons because of these programs being in place. Many of them were new and just starting to get rolling. But what would have happened, I think, if these climate programs had been in place still and hadn't been canceled, is they would have helped kind of flatten that curve. I know that's a phrase we're hearing a lot these days, but it would have helped moderate that spike from a year where there are a lot of external factors causing those emissions to go up. We would have had things like Green On, which was a program that helped people to make their furnaces more energy efficient, get free smart thermostats so they don't use as much natural gas. And that would have helped to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from heating. There are also programs to help hospitals retrofit and use less energy, and schools, as I mentioned before, and to help people buy electric vehicles as well. So with more people buying EVs, we would have helped reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. But instead, we actually saw sales plummet in Ontario right when they canceled that incentive, not surprisingly. Okay. And so these programs basically would have meant that, one cold year wouldn't have thrown off Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions by that much. So I'll dig a little bit quickly into electricity and what happened there. I know lots of people have heard the headlines about canceling all those green energy projects when Premier Ford took power. And they actually spent $230 million, over $230 million to do so. Many of these canceled contracts were actually pretty small scale, and many of them were locally owned. They were things like rooftop solar panels on the roof of a community center. These were not, huge, monstrous things that you see in the news. For the most part, they were actually relatively small. And so canceling these programs wouldn't really have impacted emissions in 2018 from electricity because they were yet to be built, but it is going to hurt us in the future. And one of the reasons that it's going to hurt us in the future is that we're going to be relying a little bit more. I wish we weren't, but the current plan is to rely a little bit more on natural gas for electricity because we won't have as much nuclear in the mix. We also won't have as much renewables in the mix because many of those projects have been canceled. So the Pickering nuclear station is going to be going offline in a couple of years or in a few years. And in order to fill that gap in generation, there really isn't much of a plan right now. The plan is to sort of let those natural gas plants rise up. And the IESO, which is our electricity system operator, released this graph that shows how much in a business as usual scenario, how much those greenhouse gas emissions from electricity, which we just got down from coal being banned, that's that huge decline you see here is all from coal. And then they're going to start to creep back up again, kind of because no one is really paying attention, and because so many of those renewable energy projects were canceled. So that's a real shame. And if you see the very bottom here, I think this was 2017, it got down to about 2.5 megatons of emissions from electricity, which is incredibly low. I will say 2017 was also a cooler summer, so that helped it. And some of the folks at the IESO said 2018 was a little bit more of a normal year for electricity, and there was just higher demand in the summer, which was driving some of those increases as well. And because there were other refurbishments of nuclear plants going on in 2018, it meant that the electricity people were burning, when they were burning it, had a little bit higher proportion of natural gas in it than usual, because there was a little bit less nuclear in the grid. Okay, so I'm gonna move on here. So lessons learned. So we can learn some things from this year of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions spiking. And one of them is that the honeymoon period from Ontario's coal ban is over. So there was that huge decline. Ontario did a lot of work to take those coal plants offline. But now we get into more of the heavy lifting. So we need deeper reductions, and we need more effort than we're seeing now from this provincial government to keep cleaning not only our grid, but many other sectors of Ontario's life. So buildings, transportation, things like that. And that there's still a lot of work to do to decouple Ontario's economic growth from its greenhouse gas emissions. And we kind of started on that trend where Ontario was growing economically and greenhouse gas emissions were going down. But there's still a lot of things like freight that correlate with that. And one of the ways that we can do that is by getting trucks to become cleaner. And so if we get cleaner trucks on the road, things like electric trucks or even just more efficient diesel trucks, then it's a little bit easier to have economic growth with those trucks still on the road. And that's one of the things actually that's going to be in our report that Evan was mentioning coming out on Wednesday, talking about some of the big health benefits we'd see from trucks just being a little bit cleaner out on the road, and how many premature deaths would be avoided from that. So a lot of these actions that we're recommending to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have a lot of health co-benefits attached to them as well, from the air pollution reductions. And the third lesson is that governments need to take action to make sure that when we have a super hot year, when we have a super cold year, when people suddenly all want the new Ford F-150, that we're not at the mercy of those patterns, that there are programs and policies in place to keep our emissions going down when those kind of things happen. So sometimes that's regulations that are in place, things like saying to automakers, your fleet has to be an average efficiency, or can only reduce this amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Governments can put in place those kind of things to make sure that we're not crippled by these sudden turns in the weather and other external factors. And so I want to talk a little bit just at the end here about recovery. And a lot of people are talking about how an economic recovery and just a general social everything recovery post COVID-19 and during COVID-19 as well, what direction we can go in. But I also want to talk about what direction we shouldn't go in. And that would be to continue to waste money ripping up renewable energy contracts. It just, it has to stop, and it doesn't make sense. It's wasting a lot of money. And I feel like it's time for Ontario's government to move on and look at the evidence and look at what's actually going to be best for everyone's health, for the climate, and for our pocketbooks as well. Another thing Ontario shouldn't do is to loosen the rules by suspending environmental protections. And they are actually starting to do that a little bit already, which is worrying. We saw them suspend and delay greenhouse gas emission reporting from some of these big polluters in industry last week. And also another thing we don't want them to do is delay planned carbon reduction programs. These things still need to happen and can be a part of our economic recovery in Ontario. And another big mistake is that people often assume that economic recovery and environmental action are completely at odds. But they absolutely aren't. And a lot of folks are talking about a green recovery now, and how working towards a lot of those climate goals and environmental goals can actually help Ontario and Canada and the world at large economically recover and create jobs. So I'll talk a little bit about what kind of green solutions would help in Ontario. One of those is investing in building energy efficiency. So instead of building, a whole bunch more new homes, why don't we retrofit the buildings that we do have to make them use less natural gas, make them need less air conditioning, and generally use less energy. And this would create a lot of jobs for people in trades, in those special green building trades in particular, but also people doing things like insulating homes, sealing up drafts and things like that. We can also create our own energy. Instead of importing natural gas from the States, why not produce more of our own homegrown renewable energy here in Ontario so that we're more resilient and we're more resource independent as well, and creating jobs. Improving transit, that's a big job creator as well. And in fact, if we not only improve transit, but electrify it and make it cleaner, many of those electric buses that we would buy are actually made in Canada. So that's a sort of double whammy economic help there. And then of course, supporting a shift to active transportation like cycling, like walking, and adding bike lanes and safer streets so that people feel more comfortable doing that. That's a great way to keep people healthy and also, keep air pollution levels low. And make sure that we have a permanent reduction in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, giving people safer ways to get out of their cars. And also electrifying personal vehicles. We talked a little bit about that, getting cleaner trucks on the road. Cleaner air has tons of health co-benefits and will help our economy in terms of helping us spend less on healthcare costs. And it's also been shown, many studies have shown that reductions in air pollution can mean that we're more resilient to respiratory diseases like COVID-19. So a lot of climate action initiatives can help with that. And how can you help? I'll just speed through these, but basically talking to your elected officials. I don't know how many of you talk to your local elected officials on a regular basis. Some of you probably do. You have an MPP who cares a lot about climate action in Guelph. And you can also start a group, even if it's just a Facebook group. That can really help give you power in numbers to speak up and bring a case to your elected officials that you want to see action. And also talking with others about the action you're taking in order to normalizing it. Talk about how great it is, how great you feel when you walk to work instead of taking your car, things like that. And then I'll just mention that we have, if you're looking for other ways to take action, Environmental Defense has a Take Action page with all of our most recent petitions. So you can check it out and see what we're working on at any time. And that's it for my presentation. But I understand there's probably lots of you who want to ask questions. So I'm going to throw it over to Evan to see if we have any.
Great, thank you. First, that was wonderful, Sarah. I think that was extremely helpful to put context to all of this. I'm just going to quickly share the results of that poll. Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment on that?
Okay, that's great. I saw it creeping up towards the yes, and I think that maybe if it's done right, is a good approach as well. Yeah.
Great. And if you don't mind, I've got a couple of stats that will probably help to add value to the, figure out how to share screen here quickly, to some of the issues that you were discussing, specifically around very distressing numbers related to total light trucks. Here are the vehicle sales for all of sorry, this is market share within 2 years, specifically in Guelph. And even here, that's 2/3 of the total vehicle sales are light trucks, and that's SUVs, pickup trucks, and vans. Very distressing, and actually went up between 2017 and 2018. And the most distressing point on this one is that Sarah, I just saw some recent numbers that just came out about vehicle sales in the first quarter of 2020. Because of COVID, obviously, the overall numbers of vehicles that were sold in Canada were down by 25%. 2 of the pickup trucks actually saw an increase at a time when all other vehicles are just tanking. So we've got a significant issue with this desire. I mean, these aren't people that are tradespeople. We understand that these vehicles need to be used for tradespeople purposes, and there's specific uses for them. But that was really problematic. And to your point, also, Sarah, this slide is 2018 over 2017 growth in EV sales. And as you pointed out, Ontario tanked. You can see where it is compared to Canada. Canada had an average of 125% increase that year. Quebec was right up there. BC was through the roof. And in Guelph, we like to take some of the credit for that. We've been pounding that EV issue for some time, but I just wanted to share those because thankfully we've been able to mitigate some of this, but imagine how much more we could have done if indeed that wasn't the case and those opportunities didn't arise. On that note, I've got a couple of questions here. Unless you've got a comment on those items that I just mentioned, Sarah, I'll jump to the questions.
Go for it.
And this is from, I think it's Jordan. Do you think cities are empowered to implement environmental government solutions at the local level? Or do you feel without provincial government support that these transitions won't happen?
That's a great question. I wish cities were more empowered because I think cities are doing some of the most inspiring things in climate action from what I've seen. But they do have a fair amount of control. They don't always have the funds to do it necessarily. But I used to work for a city councillor in Toronto, and the amount of things that are under city jurisdiction is just massive. Basically, if you can see it, if you can touch it, it's probably under city jurisdiction. So that's things like waste. That's things like the roads that we build, street lights, all those kind of infrastructure like city bridges. And so I think that a lot can be done to manage those kind of things and manage city infrastructure projects and make sure they're lower carbon, get city buildings on site, get city fleets, becoming electric. There is a lot that cities can do.
Sarah, would you mind helping us pull back? Can you pull back the curtain for us a bit on the report next week? And do you want to share some of the bits and pieces that are shareable at this point?
Totally. Yeah. I can just tell you some, just high level what we did. And it was to look at basically how, one example, how going completely 100% electric vehicles. So if all of the cars in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area suddenly became EVs, how would this impact air pollution? How would it impact greenhouse gas emissions? And it turns out doing that would save, I think it's prevent 313 premature deaths every year. It would also reduce a whole whack of greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's 7.6 megatons per year from doing that. So don't tell anyone I told you that because it's not out yet, but it would have a pretty massive impact on not only our greenhouse gas emissions in Southern Ontario, but also it would have a big impact on our health. You'd have fewer people with respiratory issues. And as Evan mentioned, a lot of, if you live close to a road, if you live close to a highway, you're automatically more at risk for asthma, for childhood bronchitis, for a host of respiratory illnesses and heart diseases as well, just by virtue of being close to a road or highway. And if you live in a major city, you live close to a road or highway. Like you can't get away from it. And it doesn't have to be that way. Switching to cleaner vehicles means that that those risk factors are significantly reduced. I mean, switching to no vehicles at all also has a big impact. So I will say that just getting people out of their cars entirely is really important. Anyway, so we've got lots of health stats for folks to look at coming out next week.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned the piece at the very end, because that wasn't one of the matrices that was laid over, the option of going to more active transportation and public transportation. It was specifically on the ICE vehicles themselves and the implications of it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we did talk about electrifying buses as well, and what kind of an impact that would have, and then also cleaner trucks too, how that would impact us.
Yeah. I found it interesting that the criteria with the cleaner trucks, that you specifically went or decided to go with best current technology of diesel trucks, as opposed to pushing, what are the impacts of them moving to electrification? And can you explain that one?
Yeah, so we wanted to design scenarios that governments could kind of get moving on very quickly. And when it comes to trucks, electric truck technology is pretty new. It's just emerging, and it's not quite at the level yet where most mainstream trucking fleet owners would be able to afford switching entirely to electric without a huge amount of subsidy or help. So we wanted to model, okay, what if we just had newer, more efficient trucks and got the really old clunkers that are the heavy polluters off the road. And it turns out that made a huge difference in people's health specifically. So we wanted to look at something that would have, that could be acted on pretty quickly with trucks. But we also made some recommendations for, why it's important and how governments can help shift to electric trucks over time, because that is important.
Got it. That's great. We've got a question from John Coco, and some of you may know John. John has been at the forefront as an engineer in his work specifically on low energy buildings. So I'm outing you there, John. Sorry about that. I've got an awful lot of respect for John. But he says the region of Waterloo has declared to meet 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050, but they have zero policy direction for reducing greenhouse gas for corporate buildings, new and existing. Any suggestions on approaching council to encourage, this is Waterloo, so KW, Cambridge, and Waterloo, approaching council to encourage them to lead from in front rather than behind.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is one of my pet peeves is governments who set targets and then just like walk away as if those targets are just gonna, achieve themselves. And I've seen a range of approaches from municipalities who've declared climate emergencies and set targets like the one you mentioned. Some of them then create a comprehensive plan and give council direction to create a comprehensive plan to meet those targets. Some not so much. So I think one of the things I'd recommend is examining, when they set those targets, what were the council directions that came alongside it? Were there any that asked staff to report back? I'm sure you probably are familiar with all this, but and what was supposed to be in those reports, and then if there is a report coming back to council with recommendations, getting a group together to try to support whatever those, if they're good staff recommendations to achieve this goal. Sometimes it's a real tough slog to get those recommendations through council. Like councilors often want to vote for that 100%, or net zero by 2050 thing. Nobody wants to look like they're voting against that. But then when it comes to the time when staff say, okay, here's how we do it, the council chambers are empty. The councilors are saying, well, how much is this going to cost? And is it really going to do anything? So that's when getting a group together, I think getting a petition together is really, really urgently necessary. And so that's what I would suggest, is rousing that political support and making it visible.
John's not is no stranger to those types of approaches, but I'm sure that helps. That helps significantly, because
John, I should probably ask you what you recommend in order to get those kinds of things through. I think everyone's muted, so I probably can't, but feel free to put it in the chat if you have recommendations too.
So I'm trying to unmute you, John, but I think the chat might be easier for you there. or not. Yeah,
Okay.
there he is.
Oh, I'm here.
You're there. Yes, go ahead, John.
Okay. Well, we are putting together a group and trying to go towards council with those kinds of issues, and certainly the big ones that we're seeing are when buildings are being prepared, the architect or the consultant will come in and say it's going to cost 20% more, and it's a number right off the top of their head, so there is no real analysis behind it. And my recommendation there is to actually get some good, solid numbers from buildings that have been built and have reached sort of net zero ready, if you will. You can get 80% reduction with very small 5 to 10% increase in the cost. Second thing seems to be that the capital budget will never interfere with the operating budget. So those that in charge of the capital budget will just hang on to their money, and the operating budget will do their side. If there's any way to encourage them to take some of the operating budget and put that operating budget savings and put that into the capital budget, that would more than cover, and you'd get the savings in the long run. Then there's a few other things, but that's two of the bigger ones for in my mind.
Awesome, thanks, John. That's
Yes.
good feedback.
Yes, thank you. Generally, a pretty quiet crowd here, needless to say. What do you hope happens coming out of the study that you're going to release next week, Sarah? What's in a perfect world, what would happen?
Well, we have a bunch of policy recommendations in the report, and so we're hoping that that government and policymakers take those really seriously and implement them. So things like having a zero emission vehicle mandate across Canada that says, you know, automakers have to sell a certain amount of electric vehicles by a certain date. That kind of thing makes sure that automakers put their money where their mouth is. And when they say they want to, you know, switch to electric vehicles, they have to sell more, they have to market them. Because one of the big problems right now is people are buying those big trucks and SUVs because they're marketed so heavily. And but a zero emission vehicle mandate puts the pressure on automakers to make sure that the electric vehicles get sold and they get some of that marketing attention. So that's just one example. I also hope that policymakers really, really think about the moment that we're in and how important our health is, and how, you know, a lot of these vehicle policies get thought of only as ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and fight climate change, and not as often about as ways to significantly improve our health and make us more resilient to things like respiratory illnesses. So I really hope that those two things start to come together, and that health and climate change are seen kind of in the same bucket a little more often.
Great. I'm just going to answer a question here. I think it's from Liz. Is that Liz Snell, I think? Is there a danger that a lot more EVs would lead to more electricity generation from natural gas, affecting the benefit? Well, let's just back up on that question a little bit. That it's one of the 20 questions that people have when they're concerned about, you know, whether or not to go to EVs. In Canada, even if you do the cradle to grave analysis, even in a jurisdiction like Alberta that's extremely fossil fuel heavy, you still see a net benefit to switching to electric. And that's also the case in places like West Virginia as well. When we look at that, you know, the total cost. I'm not avoiding your question, Liz, I promise. But at the end of the day, of course, it could mean more fossil fuel burning, specifically with natural gas. But what's missing, of course, is really aggressive conservation and efficiency. And there still is the opportunity that seems to be ignored of even importing renewable hydro from Quebec as well. It's a matter of picking our poison, and we need to decide which, you know, what would we rather have, a significantly reduced emissions or the status quo.
Yeah,
Do you want
and we
to
actually,
chat?
if I can just quickly say, we actually modeled
Yes.
that in our report,
Yes.
and we took into account the increase in natural gas-fired electricity that would come with switching to 100% EVs, and it was still huge, like net greenhouse gas emission reductions and pollution reductions as well.
We've got another question here from Jane F., and she's making reference to Halton Hills. She may be in Halton Hills, but Halton Hills is creating a revolving fund to take the savings from energy efficiency and putting it back into further energy retrofits, efficiency retrofits. Electric vehicles typically charged at night when we have access to electricity, and so we have excess electricity in Ontario. So to your first point, Jane, in Guelph, there is a program called well, actually, the name just changed, but it was called GEARS, the Guelph Energy Efficiency Retrofit Strategy, and that it's still moving along relatively slowly, but the intention there is for the city to provide low-interest loans to homeowners in order to do exactly that type of thing, to be able to put money into retrofitting for energy efficiency. And on the EVs charging at night, also from a local perspective, before I hand it over to Sarah, that Electra are the new merged electrical utility that merged with Guelph Hydro. Believe it or not, they're currently piloting a 2 cents a kilowatt charge for charging electric vehicles between midnight and I think 5 o'clock in the morning. They're doing it in a pilot, not in Guelph. They're doing it in a pilot in Markham, if I'm not mistaken, and it's quite exciting. I mean, normally we're paying somewhere around 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's quite an aggressive incentive for people to take that seriously and look at that. Sarah?
I mean, I think you answered it pretty well, Evan, so I'm happy to move on to the next question if there is one.
John B has a question above that I missed. Sorry, John B, where are you? Oh, John, there you are. I've heard information that 2/3 of energy is wasted. I think including from emerge. Yes, correct. How is the 2/3 number arrived, and what does it include? There's if you look at it strictly from we use this figure quite regularly, the 2/3 of energy that's being wasted, and that's I hate to use that cradle to grave term. There's source energy. So imagine that natural gas. We burn by and large, we burn natural gas in our furnaces, and most people try to figure out the efficiency of their furnace based on the gas that arrives at their meter. And they say I've got a 90% efficient, or a 97 or a 98% efficient system. Well, in actual fact, it took energy to extract that out of the gas fields. It also took energy to transport it here. It went in a pipeline, but they actually have natural gas-fired jets, jet engines that help propel that natural gas to get it from Alberta to here or wherever it's coming. So when you talk about the energy waste, you realize that there are a whole series of things that happen. And every time, I mean, we don't create energy, we transform it from one form to another. And every time we do it, we waste energy. When we burn natural gas, it's almost impossible to actually get 100% out of it. But inevitably, we wind up measuring it at our home as opposed to looking at that that full cost accounting from when they started digging the well to the point that you're actually burning it at home. So that's where those numbers generally come from. How are we doing for time here? Sarah, how about some final words from you here?
Oh no, you're gonna put me on the spot.
Absolutely, absolutely. No pressure, but it really has to be profound. Okay.
Oh, okay, thanks. I guess I would say that, you know, it seems funny being in the moment that we're in, looking back on 2018, and it's weird even to think about the world then, because it feels like it was such a different world than it is now. But I think that we can still learn a lot of lessons by looking at the past, and then thinking about how we're in a moment where, you know, as devastating as it is, that there are things we can do better, and there are things we can restructure. And so let's let's look to the past for some of those lessons, and let's think about how we can do things better in this moment. And if we're going to be investing in economic recovery, let's do it right. Let's do it in a way that's going to keep people in Ontario healthy, that's going to keep our, our kids and our grandkids healthy as well, and it's going to keep us healthy now. Not only employed healthy, but also, in our bodies and in our communities healthy as well. Was that profound for you?
Yeah. I think that's definitely profound enough. I'm just going to launch the final poll there, and while I launch that final poll, if I can do this simultaneously, I'm going to try to chew gum and walk at the same time here. Just a final 2 slides. This one that I want to share with you is just to remind you that next week on Thursday we have the street fight. So that's the first thing that I'd like to remind you about. And then, and June 23rd will be the Guelph release date that Sarah will be joining us once again, and she'll be here with Helen Doyle, who has a public health background, and the two of them will be presenting the results of that of the report, and really looking forward to that one, Sarah. And I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. That's, well, okay. We didn't do so badly, Sarah. Look at that.
Awesome.
Awesome is right. You did wonderfully. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. We really appreciated it. And please join us again next Thursday, and keep an eye out for the report that will be coming out soon. Take care and good night.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks,
Thank
Rasha.
you. Thanks.